Before World War II, soldiers ever set foot on a battlefield, they were trained, briefed, and prepared, or so they were told. Military instruction focused on weapons handling, discipline, physical endurance, navigation, and obedience to command. Recruits were conditioned to believe that adequate preparation and courage would be sufficient to meet the demands of war. However, there were truths about combat that no manual, instructor, or commanding officer ever fully explained. Not because these truths were deliberately hidden, but because many of the realities of war resist explanation. They are experiential, psychological, and deeply personal. They cannot be fully understood through lectures or drills. They can only be learned through exposure. This video explores the fundamental aspects of warfare that World War II soldiers were rarely warned about, realities that shaped their behavior in combat and followed them long after the war ended. Fear would be constant. Contrary to popular representations of wartime bravery, most soldiers did not experience combat as a series of heroic moments. Fear was not temporary or situational, it was persistent. Veterans frequently described fear as a physical presence: tightness in the chest, dryness in the mouth, trembling hands, and a distorted sense of time in which moments stretched unnaturally long. The most intense fear was often not experienced during active combat but during prolonged periods of waiting. Hours or days spent in trenches, foxholes, or transport vessels created a psychological strain that many veterans later described as unbearable. During these moments, soldiers had nothing to do but anticipate injury or death, allowing the imagination to amplify every possible outcome. Military training emphasized courage, but rarely explained that courage in war usually meant continuing to function while terrified. Soldiers were not told that fear would accompany them continuously, nor that experiencing fear did not signify failure or weakness. The body would react in uncontrollable ways. Few soldiers were prepared for how their own bodies would respond under extreme stress. Combat frequently triggered involuntary physiological reactions, including uncontrollable shaking, nausea, loss of bladder or bowel control, and in some cases, temporary paralysis or dissociation. These reactions were not the result of poor discipline or inadequate training. They were natural biological responses to overwhelming threat, driven by adrenaline and activation of the body's survival systems. While adrenaline increased strength and alertness, it also degraded fine motor control and complex decision-making. Tasks practiced repeatedly in training, such as reloading a weapon or issuing clear commands, could suddenly become difficult or impossible. Although soldiers were trained to rely on repetition and muscle memory, they were rarely warned that they might feel powerless within their own bodies. For many, this realization was as frightening as the enemy itself. The first death would change them forever. Nearly every veteran could recall with remarkable clarity the first death they witnessed in war. This memory was often retained with precise detail, even decades later. It might have been a close friend killed by artillery fire or an enemy soldier collapsing after being shot. Regardless of circumstance, this moment represented a psychological turning point. Death ceased to be abstract or distant. It became immediate, personal, and unavoidable. Many soldiers described a sense of emotional rupture at this point, a realization that life could end abruptly and without meaning. For some, this experience initiated emotional numbing as a coping mechanism. For others, it marked the beginning of recurring memories, guilt, or anxiety that persisted long after the war. Soldiers were not told that witnessing death could permanently alter how they perceived the world and themselves. They would stop seeing the enemy as human. Survival in combat often required emotional detachment from the enemy. Military language, training practices, and propaganda reinforced this process by reducing opposing forces to abstractions. Enemies were referred to as targets, positions, or numbers, rather than individuals. This dehumanization was rarely motivated by hatred alone. More often, it served as a psychological necessity. Seeing the enemy as fully human made lethal action more difficult, and hesitation could result in death. Emotional distancing allowed soldiers to function under conditions that would otherwise be intolerable. However, this suppression of empathy often had delayed consequences. After the war, many veterans struggled to reconcile their actions with civilian moral frameworks. In later years, memories, dreams, and reflections often reintroduced the humanity of those they fought, sometimes accompanied by regret or moral distress. Most of war was confusion, not strategy. Historical narratives of World War II frequently emphasize grand strategies and decisive battles. At the individual level, however, war was characterized by confusion. Soldiers often operated with incomplete or inaccurate information. Orders were delayed, contradictory, or unclear. Maps frequently failed to reflect actual terrain. Communication equipment malfunctioned and units became separated. Many soldiers engaged in combat without a clear understanding of their objectives or the positions of friendly forces. This uncertainty required improvisation and rapid decision-making under stress. Soldiers were trained to follow orders yet often found themselves forced to act independently in chaotic environments. The psychological burden of this responsibility was rarely acknowledged in training. They would form unbreakable bonds amid fear and chaos. Intense social bonds formed rapidly among soldiers. Shared danger created levels of trust and dependence that surpassed most pre-war relationships. Differences in background, social status, and personal history became irrelevant in the face of survival. These bonds contributed significantly to morale and unit cohesion. Soldiers often fought less for abstract causes than for the men beside them. The loss of these comrades was therefore devastating. Grief was compounded by the inability to properly mourn and the necessity of continuing to fight. Many veterans later described these relationships as the most meaningful of their lives' connections that were never fully replicated in peacetime. Surviving could be a burden. Survival did not always bring relief. Many soldiers experienced profound survivor's guilt, questioning why they lived while others died. These questions often persisted long after the war, manifesting as rumination, self-blame, and emotional withdrawal. Some veterans replayed specific moments repeatedly, convinced that different actions might have saved a friend. This psychological burden was rarely acknowledged or treated during the war. Survival, rather than being an uncomplicated victory, often became a source of long-term distress. Coming home would be the hardest battle. Perhaps the most unspoken truth of all was that returning home could be more difficult than combat itself. Civilian society expected celebration, gratitude, and heroic narratives. Many soldiers returned unable or unwilling to provide such stories. Veterans often experienced nightmares, hypervigilance, emotional detachment, and sudden anger. These symptoms were poorly understood and frequently stigmatized. As a result, many veterans chose silence not because they forgot the war but because they remembered it too vividly. The transition to civilian life required suppressing experiences that had fundamentally reshaped their identities. For many, the war never truly ended. World War II soldiers were extensively trained to fight. They were far less prepared to feel. Fear, grief, guilt, and psychological trauma were endured quietly, often without language or support. Recognizing what soldiers were never told before battle does not diminish their courage. Instead, it deepens our understanding of it. These individuals confronted not only an external enemy but an internal struggle that continued long after the fighting stopped. Remembering these truths allows for a more complete and humane understanding of war and of those who lived through it.